welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. There have been a slew of books written about the faults and foibles of college sports, some hitting very close to home as to what is really going on. About 5 years ago, journalists Joe Nocera, then of the New York Times, now of Bloomberg, and Ben Strauss, then of the New York Times, now of the Washington Post, collaborated on a look into college sports entitled Indentured: Inside the Story of the Rebellion Against the NCAA. It was one of the first books to reframe the narrative surrounding college sports. Instead of greedy athletes who sold jerseys illegally to make some extra cash, examples including Terrell Pryor and other Ohio State football players, amongst many others, the narrative shifted to how outlandish the athletic department, conferences, and the NCAA itself was behaving with billion-dollar television contracts and multi-million-dollar coaches, athletic directors, and conference commissioners. The new focus from journalists and academics became about how corrupt the system was. Indentured lands squarely in the middle of that conversation. I'm joined by Ben Strauss, co-author of Indentured and currently a sports and media writer for the Washington Post. Ben understands the college athletics media space like few others. We discuss the challenges that Division I athletics is facing and why he is skeptical about reform, and try to answer the question, is college athletics imploding because Jim Delaney retired? Welcome to the podcast, Ben. I'm joined by Ben Strauss, co-author of Indentured and currently a sports and media writer for the Washington Post. Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here, Dr. Weaver. Thanks for having me.
Very good to have you. Let's start with a question from the book jacket. Quote, how can the NCAA blithely wreck careers without regard to due process or common fairness? How can it act so ruthlessly to enforce rules that are so petty? Why won't anybody stand up to these outrageous violations of American values and American justice? Yes, this was written probably in 2015. Here we are in 2021. Would it be accurate to say that the NCAA still has that power? Or is it an organization so deflated by the events of the last 2 years that folks just don't feel the abject terror of the NCAA investigation anymore?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. I think a lot of that, there was a lot of due process, related to those questions when the book came out, but really you had this 400-page rule book, and so much of it was related to what an athlete could not get. There was forever an athlete could get a sandwich, but if you put cream cheese on it, or you could get a bagel, but if you put cream cheese on it, that wasn't okay. And so with these new NIL rules, I think that really, really reshapes, both the NCAA rulebook and college sports in general. But that was, one of the key pieces of what the rulebook was and what those questions were referring to. In the book, I always remember there was a Mississippi State football player in the 70s who lost 3 years of his career because he got a $12 discount on a pair of pants. And so, stuff like that, where, you can, do an endorsement for the pants store now.
And get as many pairs of pants as you want.
That is what for so long what we talked about with NCAA rules, and yeah, the NIL rules, sort of do make that a moot point.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I almost feel like the organization has been neutered in some ways. It just feels like it's sort of limping along. And even this morning, some general consensus ideas came out about the Constitutional Convention and what the first draft might look like. And it feels like they've taken one little baby step forward. If in fact those ideas are what comes true, it just feels like they're almost incapable of really thinking about massive change.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think one thing I would always say when we talk about the NCAA is it is the folks in Indianapolis, but the people voting on this rules are college presidents. It's the universities. And so when we say the NCAA, what we're saying is we are talking about the same universities. It's a little bit like the UN, where it's made up of the countries, but sort of you can, sling your arrows at the UN and then everybody else, sort of evades the scrutiny. But when we talk about the NCAA, we're also talking about these universities that have been slow to evolve, have not wanted to evolve, and have been happy to take a lot of the money that's coming in without sharing it really. Um, but no, this is not new. The NCAA like could have evolved fairly easily on NIL and adopted some sort of Olympic model years ago. They went to court even before the O'Bannon case and said that the cost of attendance stipend, was going to ruin college sports. Uh, and so, when you say the sky is falling for everything, it's a little bit like the boy who cried wolf. And as we've seen this season, the NIL rules have had minimal impact on the popularity of college football and really how the sport has run in general. But no, a different organization, more progressive, more forward thinking, perhaps didn't need to spend tens of millions of dollars on legal fees, probably more, hundreds of millions of dollars over the last 10 years, and could have gotten to this place fairly easily, right? Avoided this, idea of, these players are employees, avoided, a question that's going to come at some point of whether they should get salaries from the university, and adopted this Olympic model a long time ago. And I think that, a lot of the criticism and a lot of the lawsuits would have been, it would have looked a lot different.
And it's also quite stunning to think that in this day and age, we still have college presidents who really do not understand how to think about this as a broader responsibility to all of higher education rather than just in what's in the best interest for my school and my conference when they're voting. And you mentioned about not being able to share revenues. That is one of the biggest problems that I think that the NCAA has faced all the way back to 1972, when the former president of Long Beach State stood up in front of the entire convention and says, I think we need to take from the rich and give to the poor to help everybody rise all their boats. And he was nearly laughed out of the convention because he felt that sharing revenues was a good thing. And we still have trouble with sharing, Ben, I think.
I think this is, I mean, it sort of speaks in one way to sort of how disparate the organization is, right? Like when you have the same college governing body that's supposed to, ostensibly set the rules for Alcorn State and Alabama. Those are entirely different institutions with entirely different goals for their athletic program, entirely different ways to achieve them, entirely different ways to go about it. And what works for those two schools is not the same. And so, where does this go? It seems to me that sort of these bigger schools are going to continue to have different values and different resources and different agendas than the smaller schools, and at some point are just going to have their own, governing system.
Yeah, I think we are moving in that direction, particularly with Division One. I think Division One does need to split up. I do think that the most, what we call the Power Five, the most wealthiest institutions do need to take care of their own shop because nobody else can keep up with them. Even if you just try to be in basketball-centric conference, you can't keep up with the spending that a football-driven university has. I think that's really hurting, and they just need to accept that they need to split off. What happens with the revenues? They can all stay within the NCAA from the March Madness tournament, but I think the football revenue schools need to go off and do their own thing. What do you think?
Well, you already have the football, college football playoff has nothing to do with the NCAA, right? It's run by these, handful of big conferences. So yeah, I mean, you go back to the Regions decision in the 80s. This has been actually now close to 40-year process, but I think absolutely we're headed that way.
Yeah, I think so. So let's go back in time a little bit and think about this term, the National Letter of Intent, which at the time, and I guess today still bounds an athlete to a school and to a coach. Now, with the transfer portal being wide open, it seems to have created a revolving door where coaches will have to recruit off of other teams' rosters to gain some seniority on their teams because they're assuming that their kids are going to leave. How did we get to this point, and did the pendulum swing too far?
Well, we got to this point by the intransigence of like the leadership of college sports. the pendulum was so skewed for so long, 50 years of, coaches can leave whenever they want. And, they're getting these huge golden parachutes. Charlie Weiss leaves Notre Dame and is getting paid 15 years later. Um, that's how we got to this point. So I don't think it's gotten too far. I think the system was professionalized, and this is where you're left with a professionalized system. So I think that when you bring in this amount of money and you have different rules for the coaches and the players, and you professionalize everything except for the players, now when the players are suddenly catching up or sort of, part of the economy, they get some of the same freedoms that the adults in the system have had forever. The idea that it's swung too far, I think, is a little unfair. I think that people set these rules and somehow that now they apply to the athletes themselves. What are we doing here? Or has the pendulum swung too far? I think it's a little it's a little unfair.
Yeah, and I think some folks are eagerly awaiting the NBA's decision to just take kids right out of high school, or to allow them to come into their farm system and not have to deal with one and dones in the NCAA. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that will be a good, just sort of like freedom of labor. But if you recall, when that was put into place, the NCAA was very pleased, right? Because they were going to get these Carmelo Anthony's for a year instead of losing, Kobe and Kevin Garnett and LeBron James. And so I think that has really swung the way that college sports thinks about that.
Yeah,
But I think everybody at this point would, right? The NBA has their own farm system now. They have one particular team where they're taking what would be freshmen in high school, as sort of this all-star team who would play, around the country. And so they're already looking, how they can serve that, top layer of talent. But I do think it's really interesting to note how differently the leadership of college sports thinks about that rule today versus when it was put into place. But I think everybody agrees the next collective bargaining agreement is not going to include that.
right. I think that's in 2023. Does that sound right?
I do not know. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I don't think it's that far away.
Okay. So you and I are huge students of the impact that media and media revenues have had on college sports. It seems like the Division I market has shifted away from the concept of one good team playing an average team on a given weekend to trying to drive two powerhouse teams being handpicked for an early season matchup like this past weekend with Oregon, Ohio State, or with Penn State, Auburn coming to mind. Put on your wizard hat and walk us through your thoughts on this inflection point. Does it mean that we're going to constantly seek out more of these powerhouse matchups every weekend? And if so, what does that mean for the FBS, for college football playoff, and the way Division I is structured?
Yeah. Okay. So my wizard hat. Here we go.
Wizard, yes.
I guess that's the two things that I think about. One is when you think about these media companies that need these games, they're paying more and more money. ESPN, Fox, CBS. I don't know how much money. ESPN might be paying $300 million a year for the SEC package that they're stealing away from CBS, who in the previous iteration was paying, a fraction of that, which was probably the best deal in all of sports TV. But speaks to how valuable these properties are in a fragmenting universe. When scripted television, everybody's streaming, nobody watches, primetime TV on NBC anymore. So they're more valuable, they're paying more money, and the media companies want to get more out of them, right? So you want Penn State playing Auburn versus, Penn State playing Rutgers on a Saturday night. And so
or Villanova this weekend.
Yes. Villanova this weekend. So you're having media companies playing more and more roles. You saw this with ESPN being involved in realignment, and ESPN's role in the SEC going after Texas and Oklahoma, because they've now acquired the SEC rights, and those are going to be even more valuable to ESPN if you add Texas and Oklahoma. We may end up getting litigation around that from the Big 12. Seems like the Big 12 has walked it back a little bit, because eventually they're going to go back to ESPN for their own deal. But yeah, no, there's no question that the media companies have played a role. And then when you talk about, or you ask about, what does it mean, you're getting more of these matchups, which the media companies are asking for, I think you're just moving sort of toward a place where you have a split off, bigger super conference of however many schools and whoever gets to make it. And, those are the ones that are going to play each other. They generate the TV ratings. It's not any different than the Super League that's been proposed in Europe, where the TV companies have realized that there are more valuable teams than others. And like with so much in our society these days, the middle ground is, getting smaller, and you're having, the haves and the have-nots, and the people that drive value are worth more than ever, and the people who don't are worth less than ever. And it seems like that's in the same way we talked about, before, where you're headed in college football. These big brands that can drive big TV audiences and be valuable to media companies are going to become more valuable than ever. And if you're not in that group, you are going to be less valuable than ever, because there's going to be less impetus to share. And the teams that are driving that value are going to keep more of that money.
Did you have any initial reaction to the immediate press conference called by the Big Ten, ACC, and the Pac-12 to form an alliance? Did you have any sense what that meant?
Yeah. What is the alliance? That was my question. We're going to call a press conference and announce something. I don't think they know what they're going to do, but it felt like they had to say something. Yeah. And so they said something
to change the
but I don't know what, we sit here weeks later. I don't know what they said.
I don't either, other than I think the Pac-12 now has an alliance with the SWAC. So I'm not sure where that alliance fits in with the other alliances.
No, I think we sort of when I think for a long time, Jim Delaney was the most powerful person in college sports, and he retired. And very, very clearly, the most powerful person today is Sankey at the SEC.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think he is driving the future of college sports more than anybody else.
Well, there's been several news reports that have come out recently that basically said the SEC is on track in a couple of years to out-earn the NCAA in terms of total conference revenue.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I mean, I think that if you're the Big Ten, you sort of, have been lapped a little bit. The Big Ten used to be the most powerful conference in college sports, and they've clearly been surpassed by the SEC.
So did Delaney's retirement leave a vacuum that Sankey could move into?
Yeah, I think that if you don't look at that as one shift, then you're missing something for sure.
Yeah. Well, going back to the book Indentured, one of the things that you wrote, because you have an entire chapter on your conversation with Jim Delaney and him kind of reflecting back. He was still, 3 years away from retirement, I think, when you interviewed him, something like that. But he told you something. What's good for the Big Ten has been good for college sports. And I thought that was a very interesting, telling comment, because he was very critical in your chapter of all the things that were going on outside the Big Ten. But inside the Big Ten, all the changes that he brought forth were all good for college sports.
Yeah. That was 3 years, right? What was his retirement package? Was he got a $20 million or something like that? He's brilliant. He conceived of the Big Ten network before anybody else realized this. Looked at realignment and conference expansion, and sort of what would it mean to have TV areas in New Jersey and the DC area. Brilliant, and kept the Big Ten ahead of Roy Kramer's SEC, for a long time. Also, somebody who speaks very romantically about his own college experience and playing for on the North Carolina basketball team. And there is a little bit of a disconnect between, sort of the romanticized version of college sports as a pastime where you use sports to get ahead in life as academics, and sort of college sports as a, multi-billion-dollar business, where you have to raise all this money and then, can't share that with the players. It's, he's one of the most important people in the course of the history of college sports, for sure.
Yeah, and you pressed him a little bit on some of the legal challenges. And just as a reminder to the audience, Jim was a lawyer. He thought of things in a very legalistic kind of way. And one of the things you said is he loves to compete. He loves to compete with ideas. And when you asked him about the various legal challenges, he says, well, let's find out who's right. When the courts and Congress decide how these statutes are applicable, whether it be Title IX, labor law, antitrust law, I'll live with that because I live in America. But access to the courts goes both ways. And if I disagree, let's get out there and compete. Well, what do you think Jim Delaney would say today?
I don't know. I guess that's a pretty interesting question. What would he say today? I guess he would say, didn't he? I think at one point he said the Big Ten would go to Division III.
Yes.
If I don't know if I can't remember when he said that or where he said it. I know he had very dramatic testimony in the O'Bannon case, talking about his own experience, and that might have been, he said, we'd go play Division III, we'd take our ball and go home.
Yeah.
I don't know what he would say. I don't know. But I haven't talked to him in a while. I would like to ask him. You should have him on the podcast.
I should have him on the podcast. That would be great. Yeah, I thought a lot about the void. I really feel like, and COVID enhanced all this, but I really feel like a serious void happened when he retired, and everybody has the right to retire. But he was the standard bearer. The Big Ten Conference Network was the standard bearer. How they treated female athletes was the standard bearer. Their sense of creating higher academic standards for athletes to compete was the standard bearer. And I feel like the Big Ten, and to some degree the Pac-12, has lost that narrative. And the SEC is comfortably up top saying bigger is better, more money is better, and therefore we will be better.
I think more money is better it's not a new ethos.
No.
I think Delaney would say more, I do think that there is a power vacuum, and Sankey has filled it, right? And he really can shape the future of college sports, because, right, like the Big Ten and the Pac-12 are chasing the SEC, right? Like, I don't think Jim Delaney's Big Ten would have had to call a press conference to announce an alliance because they needed to say something.
Yeah.
And I don't know what they would have done, but I sort of imagine he would not have been caught flat-footed by the SEC announcing, Texas and Oklahoma.
In case you hear that thunder, it is Jim Delaney speaking. I just think it's we're at a very interesting place. And the other thing I wanted to comment about is the new Pac-12 commissioner, George Kliavkoff, who comes from an entertainment and casino background. What do you think about that impact on the media inside college athletics?
Well, the Pac-12, right? They hired Larry Scott because he was an executive at the Tennis Channel, I think, and that was just a disaster, So I think that the Pac-12 hopes they have better luck this time around. I can't say that I've done a lot of reporting or know a ton about the new commissioner, but it shows you where those college presidents think this is headed. That those are the skills they need. The gambling thing, right? I think everybody in sports media and sort of the business of sports is like, running headlong and trying to wrap their arms around this gambling thing, because as you see traditional, revenue sources going away, advertising, as part of the TV bundle, cable fees as part of the TV bundle, you got to replace that somehow, because this has been the driving force behind, the business of sports, from the NFL down to, the Big Ten, over the past 30 years. I think you're seeing, people are desperate to fill in some of that missing revenue, and gambling comes along and offers, people this safety net, and everybody from the pros to college will have to see what the repercussions of that are, and if it's as valuable as they seem to think that it is.
I just see colleges following right along with what the NFL is doing, and they just set a partnership with 5G with Verizon. They're going to put 5G in every stadium in the country so they can get delivered gambling information right to the phones. So you can gamble while you're sitting in your seat. I think college football is going to say, we want that.
I don't think anybody has really ever said no to a lot of money in college sports. That's not, there's been a lot of hand wringing about it, but no one has ever said, keep your money, really, to anybody, ever.
It's true. It's true, because we never have enough money, because we always spend what we get. It doesn't matter. There's no budget. We just spend it.
Yeah.
So the last thing is, there was a piece in Sports Business Journal the other day about Jeffrey Kessler joining the legal team to try to seek further reparations for past restraints on NIL and share of TV revenues for the players who previously played. Now, neither one of us is a lawyer, but my thoughts are that Kessler doesn't jump into any case he doesn't think he can win. He can't win. And a reminder, Kessler was the lead attorney in the NCAA v. Alston case in front of the Supreme Court this summer. What in the world would this do if Kessler and his team are able to win reparations going backwards?
Yeah. It would be a big deal. I think they did get some money in the Alston case for previous athletes. The money for individual athletes was kind of small, but the total pot was, in the tens of millions of dollars. Kessler is pretty good at this. He's got a long record on this. The courts have been a little unwilling to hit red buttons in college sports. And even the Supreme Court, ahead of the NIL new rules that the NCAA said they weren't going to have anymore, decided a case about educational expenses very narrowly. And there was this blistering opinion by Justice Kavanaugh. It didn't actually do anything. It was just sort of an addendum opinion. And so I remain somewhat skeptical that there's any court that is going to go ahead on its own and say, the NCAA and all these schools need to pay former athletes, hundreds of millions of dollars. Even if the legal case looks pretty strong, sort of the practical effects of what it means in higher education and, throwing some sort of huge wrench into like the way college sports functions hasn't been something that any court has actually wanted to do. And so with the new rules, and even if, right, you sort of look at it as a legal case and say this is pretty slam dunk case, we have seen courts bend over backwards to say the NCAA broke the law, but we're not going to do anything about it. So until courts do something besides that, I am a little skeptical of what they're willing to do on a huge grand scale.
Oh, yeah, fair enough. And you never know. And the makeup of the court does seem to make a difference in their attitudes. And certainly NCAA v. Alston, the conversation amongst the justices in April was fascinating to hear the questions they asked and how they viewed the situation, wholly different from way back in 1984. And so it's change. Yeah, absolutely. Ben Strauss, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast to talk all things media and indentured, and just congratulations on the great writing you're doing at the Washington Post. I enjoy reading it.
It's always good to see you on virtually, at least. But thank you. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.